I think actually that is like the perfect note to transition to talking about your article. As I mentioned, you have a new article in Jacobin that looks at the rise and fall of the manufacturing sector in the U.S. You covered a study that recently came out on this very topic. So basically, okay. So first, also sort of related to the article and related to race, I do feel like I have to say, when we talk about the manufacturing sector in the U.S., I think oftentimes people sort of across the political spectrum just assume that this sector is populated like exclusively by quote white guys in hard hats, right? Like I hear that like all the time. Now the study in the piece, or the study that you cover in your piece, I think in a way challenges that characterization by talking about how the manufacturing sector actually played a very crucial role in the creation of a Black middle class in the US. So maybe first just take us through that. How did the manufacturing sector kind of give rise to generation of economic security for middle class Black families?
Yeah, and I'll start maybe a slightly pedantic point, but just to be clear on terminology, and how I interpret the use of the term middle class in this context. And I know you and Kale have had good conversations on this term. And I think in this context, I mean, I look at this as more as meaning a relatively more stable portion of the working class. So people who can, have decent benefits, can afford to retire, can reasonably expect that their kids can maybe go to college. So that's, I think, when we talk about middle class in this context, I like to think of it of a more stable part of the working class. But think about the story we're often told about deindustrialization, even by people who I think are sincerely pro-labor and are not, total race reductionists. I think the story is kind of more like, this period right before and after World War II. Mostly white men got access to these, good manufacturing union jobs. They were able to attain a stable middle class lifestyle. And it was the white working class that was devastated by deindustrialization, by bad trade deals like NAFTA. And so, the loss of these good private sector union jobs is primarily a story about white workers. And now we're seeing that play out, in white working class people being attracted to populism. And so that's a story I think we're often told, and many parts of it are true, but I think it's very incomplete. And it leaves us with a really distorted overall picture of what's happened in this country over the past 45, 50 years. So this study I looked at is called The Unmaking of the Black Blue-Collar Middle Class. And in short, it shows that there was, in fact, a significant Black middle class that was created from these kinds of unionized manufacturing jobs. Most clear example of this was in the auto industry, and that's what I look at the most, but it also happened in steel, consumer electronics, the rubber industry, and more. And, and therefore I think, and not that this is a competition, but if anything, deindustrialization, I think, has caused even more pain in working class Black communities. It's even more of a pressing issue in Black communities. And so, to get into some of the details of how this emerged, the timing of this with blue collar Black workers, I think, was different than white workers. And in many ways, it was a fortunate piece of timing where the civil rights movement achieved major gains in the early and mid 1960s, right at the same time where there was still strong economic growth and many of these industries were expanding. And I think it's important to remember that, Black employment in these industries and membership in these unions, it did not just start in the 1960s. When the CIO emerged in the 1930s, Black workers gained a foothold in many of those industries and those unions. During World War II, we had A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington movement, which was pushing for Black workers in the wartime industries. He had some success in achieving that. But you have a few key factors coming together in the 1960s. You have a strong civil rights movement allied with labor. They pushed Kennedy first to sign things like Plans for Progress, which regulated employment discrimination with federal contractors. So by the time of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the so-called, what they called the big three auto companies, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, signed on to this Plans for Progress, this commitment to hire more Black workers. You have the creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 1965. This was another civil rights gain, and this strengthens the kind of oversight. And it really makes a difference in allowing more Black workers access to these industries. And it also helped that the auto industry was growing and needed more workers. You also had the timing of a lot of white workers who maybe were hired in the 30s and 40s were retiring at that time anyway. So there's this need, there's a powerful civil rights movement, there's legislation to enforce this. All these things come together. And so by 1966, you have over 100,000 black workers in the auto industry, in the Auto Workers Union. And so overwhelmingly, these are people without a high school education, but these are jobs with good wages, great benefit packages. These people could expect, even though they did not have a college education, they could reasonably expect that their child could go to college and presumably make more money than they did. And so, even though you have deindustrialization is already well on its way by the 1970s, actually way before that, this trend with black workers continues even into the 1980s, the early 80s. And so contrary to all these really stupid stereotypes about industrial workers being white men, by the early 80s, you actually had black workers overrepresented in the union movement. And so by the time of the early 80s, they were 9% of the labor force, but almost 14% of unionized workers. So that's kind of what this story, tells and what this study gets into. And one thing that's kind of striking for me looking at this is, for me, it really validates the perspective of civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Philip Randolph, Barry Rustin, who believed that after getting civil rights legislation, the immediate next task was to ensure good employment for African Americans, or else the civil rights legislation would be largely meaningless. They needed to continue to grow the ranks of black workers in organized labor. And I think the historical record all the way up to now shows that, whatever black middle class we have built in this country, public and private sector unions have been central to that.
Yeah. I think that all also underscores a point that people like Touré Reed and, Judith Stein and others have made, which is that the anti-discrimination legislation obviously is a very central and key component of helping black workers enter, the middle class or, kind of a floor of economic stability. But at the same time, that unless that happens in conjunction with a growing economy and a growing, either manufacturing sector, whatever sector is providing these decent jobs, it's not going to do much. So maybe on that note, talk a little bit now about what happened after. How did deindustrialization change the fortunes of, this rising black middle class?
Yeah, and I guess, part of it is a story of how this post-war prosperity, came undone. And I think there were many factors that led to the post-war growth and prosperity for many working people. Strong labor movement certainly was part of it. New Deal, things like that were part of it. But I think the other factor was that a lot of our industrial competitors were just flattened and destroyed after World War II. And U.S. industry did not really have much strong competition. But that situation could not last forever. And as long as the major investment decisions were in the hands of capital, these gains of the post-war period were going to be tentative and I think precarious. And so if you look at the auto industry again, it was actually the rise of the Japanese auto industry that really eroded these gains for blue-collar black workers. And really actually that not just the rise of the Japanese auto industry, but the response by U.S. companies as well. Right. And so, Japanese auto plants, they emerge more productive, more profitable. So what do U.S. companies do? They cut from the workforce, they offshore, they attack unions. And, this begins a vicious cycle that hurts all workers, but black workers bear the brunt of it. And what's even worse is that when Japanese plants located to the United States, they deliberately stayed away from urban centers with high black populations. And there's even, you can see in their company records, they actually deliberately stayed away from black workers due to certain racial stereotypes that they had. So, black workers cannot even in large part take advantage of some of the new opportunities from these Japanese transplants. Right. And so, this process begins in the 1980s, and it's been a downward slide ever since. To put some figures to this, in 2009, black workers had less than 60,000 jobs in the auto industry. So this is just 33% of their peak level of employment in the 1970s. And this really happens across the board in manufacturing because it wasn't just in auto. The steel industry was one of the largest employers of black male manufacturing workers. So overall, the percentage of black workers in manufacturing was at 23% in 1979. By 2007, it was less than 10%. So this is a dramatic, drop off on what happens with these unionized workers. And I think we have a graphic from the study that also kind of illustrates this. You can see starting in 1979, just the decline of black manufacturing workers, but also union membership. What's also striking here is you look at this compared to white workers, and you actually see they're very close throughout this whole time period, both in percentage of workers in manufacturing and union membership. And I think, in fact, African Americans are slightly higher in some areas in union membership. So again, this is clearly affecting the whole working class, but I think black workers, it's hitting harder for them. And I think that the part of the story too is not just, international competition and things like that, but I think the failure of things like the freedom budget, which civil rights leaders were pushing, which called for full employment. And what was key about that was that this was calling for the government to take ownership of this and, state-led investment in employment, because what this story shows is that, once the private sector was not going to be providing these jobs and was cutting and offshoring, if the government is not stepping in, then no one will. And so I think the failure of the freedom budget and really the failure of a social democratic tendency in U.S. politics is also part of why we've seen this, decline over the years. And what has replaced these good paying jobs? I mean, really nothing except mass incarceration, unemployment, low-wage service sector jobs, and now, in many working class black communities, if you aren't able to get into the public sector, absent that, there's really not many good options for you, and that's kind of where we're at today.
Right. So that, I guess, of course, leads us to the question of what can we do about this? And I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit because I know that there are people out there who would say something like, well, you make a perfectly fine case for how the manufacturing sector and, specifically unionized manufacturing jobs helped create this black middle class. But those jobs are gone. They're never coming back. We're not going to reshore manufacturing. What we should be doing is focusing on making these bad jobs, care work, service work. We need to make these jobs better. We're not going to bring back manufacturing. And in fact, to try to bring back manufacturing again is just a kind of misguided nostalgia for, a white or whatever working class that doesn't exist any longer. So, the question for you, Paul, is the large question is is there a viable industrial policy that the U.S. can undertake today? And how do we make jobs good again?
Yeah. Well, it definitely is a kind of both and thing. Absolutely, we need to make the bad jobs good. Right. We should try to be organizing the service sector. But I think we have to think about industrial policy and bringing back manufacturing, blue-collar work. But of course, it's not going to look the same. It doesn't have to be the same exact industries in the same way. So, thinking about a worker-centered Green New Deal, which covers all elements of infrastructure, public transit expansion. You need someone to build that, retrofitting buildings, as well as things like nuclear energy, solar, winds, that are union jobs. So that really, to me, is an industrial policy. I think Green New Deal done in a way that centers workers is part of an industrial policy. There's also our basic infrastructure. I want to be in a world eventually where we are 100% done with cars, but while we do have cars, our roads should not have craters in them like they do in Philadelphia. Our bridges, Pennsylvania, about a year ago, we had a bridge collapse near Pittsburgh. So maintenance of basic infrastructure is part of this too. And I think, electric vehicles, electric vehicle batteries. These are the kinds of things manufacturing does not mean, let's go back to just making gas-powered cars again and things like that. I think there's all kinds of things that fall under that umbrella. And I think along with that, fighting for things like, funding our trade schools, career technical education programs within public schools. In most schools in urban areas, these programs have been cut. And, I've talked about this before. If you are a working class student who cannot afford to go to college or does not want to, if you had a trade school option that would give you a path to a good, sustainable life. If you cut that off and you're cutting college off at the same time, you really don't have many options. So, fighting for that kind of public school funding where every school can have a good career technical education program as part of it. I think these are the things we should be thinking about. And these are things that, would disproportionately benefit Black workers. And I think that are on Black voters' minds in very real ways.
Yeah. I'm a little nervous about invoking this word because it gets a bad rap for good reason, but what you're describing kind of almost sounds like it might have bipartisan appeal too. Just putting that out there.
Yeah, I mean, possibly.
Possibly.
I'm still waiting to see these so-called pro-working class Republicans actually get on board. I mean, you see it in certain local areas, in my area, you will often see in suburban counties, building trades unions supporting Republicans when they're the only game in town because, often enough a Republican will support a certain infrastructure thing. So I think there's opportunities, but I think bipartisan in the sense of, in terms of ordinary voters, these are the kinds of things that would have, 70-80% support. And, this is important. I mean, thinking about where the Democratic Party is heading, and it's there's a lot of talk about migration of Latino voters to Republicans. Same thing is happening with Black voters. Not to be clear, it's not happening in the same way. And I don't think that in 10 years you're going to have most Black voters voting Republican. I don't think that's ever going to happen. But the fact that it's happening at all in this age where Democrats are talking about race all the time and they're describing Republicans as racist all the time really should raise some eyebrows about what's going on here. And, I got to pull this clip up again, but you have people like Joy-Ann Reid who criticizing, the basic infrastructure bill on the basis that these are jobs for just white men. And what's kind of incredible about this is someone like Joy-Ann Reid rarely will criticize the Biden administration. So when they do, it's kind of a big deal. And the thing she chooses to criticize is probably one of the few fairly decent proposals they had around an infrastructure bill. But this mindset is just very out of step with Black voters. So, we might want to take a listen to that now.
Let's take a look.
Let me ask you this question. Do you think it was a mistake looking back? Because, the infrastructure bill that was passed was cleaved apart from what's now being called Build Back Better. And in a sense, it's a bill that's like a white guy employment act, right? There's going to be a lot of working class men that are going to get employed by that bill, but that's the very cohort that is much more likely to reward Republicans for that. That's who they vote for. Most, working class white guys vote Republican.
I just want to say that clip came out last year, I think, and I feel like I sent it to you, and I was like, Joy-Ann Reid made this just to troll you.
Yeah, and it was one of the few times I was sympathetic towards Pete Buttigieg. What he did in his response to this, but this is just incredibly wrong-headed thinking, and also, and I know I've said this before on this show, thinking about the building trades. Again, there's no denying that there has been a history of exclusion, discrimination in the trades. But two things I want to say about this is, you got to look at the region because, many cities, you look around the building trades, you're going to see a lot of Black and brown workers who are there who would benefit a lot from bills like an infrastructure bill. But also the second point of that is if we want to remedy the situation, you got to create more jobs and you got to create a need to expand these apprenticeship programs. Going back to what I kind of described with the auto industry happening, it only, Black workers only got that opportunity because the industry was expanding and there were just more jobs. They needed to hire more people. And if there's ever a situation where you do not need to hire more people and you're cutting back, that we're not going to solve this problem of, not enough workers of color in the trade. So really the only way to remedy that is an infrastructure bill that, would create the need for more work. And so, what we should criticize from the Biden bill is it wasn't nearly big enough. It was not ambitious enough really for that task.
Right. All right. Well, Paul, we will link your article below. Again, that is out in Jacobin. Good to see you. Labor Paul, as always. Yeah. We will see you soon, I'm sure. Thanks for being here.
All right. Great to be back.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.